Welcome to Cottontails Podcast, produced by KC Digital Storyteller, the digital historian of Silicon Valley. The creator of the documentary A Place at the Table that tells the history of some of the African American pioneers of Silicon Valley, available on Vimeo.com on demand. Cottontails Podcast will consist of technologists, engineers, and professionals in a variety of fields, as well as individuals with entrepreneurial pursuits from the past and present. This is part 2 of Chris Cotton, DevOps engineer, a high-level technologist currently working with Google. When we ended the last podcast, we were talking about the open sources available to a software engineer today. Chris, can you tell me more about that? Your career path has been circuitous. Would you suggest that that's a normal way to get to where you're going, or is that a way that was just your way? Is there a path now that is much more direct that would get people into the DevOps field?
I would hesitate to recommend that for most people. I think a lot of the temperament that gravitate towards this industry, some of the best technical people have a mild form of autism called Asperger's disease, which is extremely beneficial for focusing on detail-oriented, highly structured task work. The problem with that is that it doesn't allow you this ability to change gears very quickly and move from one paradigm to another. Whereas I think I kind of have the opposite. I kind of have constructive ADD. So I tend to be able to context switch and move into different realms fairly quickly. And I tend to enjoy that kind of work. It doesn't stress me out. I think a lot of people, they're more comfortable with focusing on one thing and sort of doing that in a repetitive fashion, and then being an expert in one particular area. I think most of the engineers that I meet, there's a few of us out there that are kind of like me, where we get more of a kick out of learning new things, playing with bleeding edge technology. I'm getting a little older, so I'm not playing with as bleeding edge as I used to. I tend to be a little bit more practical than I used to, but yeah, I like more variety, and I like more paradigm shifting. I like moving with the times. Most people in my field tend to be specialized, so I don't know if that's going to always be the case, but in my day it was more like that. I think now, I suspect that now, with the internet age, with the massive increase and uptick in the amount of information we have to process in a given day, I think my sort of brain type might be the future. I don't know. I'm speculating.
So my guess is there's a need for both.
Yes.
Because my background is human resources and recruitment, and depending upon the division I was working for at the time, there were certain types of people that would fare better in one division and not another. Say QA, for instance. In QA, you don't want the person who can't concentrate for a long time, because that person has to be detail oriented almost to the nth degree, where there will be no errors. And so their mind has to be focused. But if that person is going into a more risky area where there's a lot of design and development going on, the person who can make those quick moves is better suited for that type of work. So it really depends.
Well, yeah.
Would you say?
Factor two is you have to take into consideration is that what is your tolerance for learning curves? Do learning curves excite you, or do they exhaust you? Would you rather be in a situation where you know the space very well and you feel very comfortable and very competent, or are you comfortable with kind of always being a beginner every 6 months on something and then coming up to speed quickly, getting it quickly powering through intermediate stage and going right to advanced in a matter of days or weeks, and then almost getting, for lack of a better word, bored, and then going, oh, okay, what else is new? And then, it depends on the personality type. And I'm finding more people like that than I did, let's say, 15 years ago, who filter into the industry. Whereas before, I think people were more staid and more focused and more specialized, and even especially now, that one of the factors that contributes to it as well. And I probably should think about this a little deeper and have like a nice little list for you. But one of the things I can think of that contribute to this significantly is question repositories like Stack Overflow. So you type in, hey, I've got this error. Anybody else out there seen that, right? When I first came in the industry, you say you're getting this error, you're having this problem, you scratch your head, you walk to the smartest guy in your group, and they knew the most about how everything worked. And then you would ask them, hey, have you ever seen this? And then they would tell you, oh, yeah, that's this and this and this. Now what you can do is you can type the error message or the question into Google, into a search engine. Search engine finds an answer on Stack Overflow. You go to Stack Overflow and you see 15 people ask that same question. They got 12 different answers, and you can try out, the 12 different answers in sequence until one of them works for you. So you don't need to have this super smart specialist guy working 2 cubes down from you anymore. They're out there posting answers on Stack Overflow for all the world. So the smartest guy in the world is available to the average, to a beginner. A smartest guy in the world living in London is available to a beginner in Japan at the click of a mouse.
So really, I had the impression that a lot of that open sourceness feeling that we had back in the 70s and 80s in the Valley, I had the impression that it was gone. But what I'm hearing, not only is it here, but it's expanded globally, so it's across the globe.
It's literally become the foundation of the industry. Like, nobody starts from scratch anymore.
Wow. So yeah, that and I used say, for instance, Squarespace to build my website.
Correct.
And that was just a template, really. And from there, my website, in my opinion, would never have been built had I not have Squarespace, because I don't know how to build from scratch.
Well, Squarespace is built for someone like you who says, listen, I don't want to learn I don't want to learn all the ins and outs of being a web designer, but I want to build my own website. So a bunch of people got together who really know how to build websites, and they said, how do I make this simple for the person who doesn't want to learn how to build websites, but they want to build a website, a non-web designer to build a website? Okay, well, guess what? There's all these layers to it. I'm just giving you a perfect example of how open source fits into what you just described, right? So one of the layers, let's say, is the way that the website, the layout of the website responds to different devices. The technical term for that is called responsiveness, responsive design, meaning that if I'm on a mobile device, the site's going to look different than if I'm on a 27-inch monitor. And it's going to look different again if I'm on an 11-inch iPad versus 27-inch monitor, an iPhone 4 versus an iPhone 6S versus a Samsung, et cetera, et cetera. The website is responsive. It knows how to readjust itself to fit the various devices. Well, that technology is open source. Some group of people worldwide contributed, started building this, something called Bootstrap, it's called. It's a piece of open source software, Bootstrap toolkit. And they all collaborated in their spare time and contributed to this Bootstrap toolkit. There were pull requests, and there was all this coding that went on for the love of solving this really nasty problem that every web designer in the whole world was having. So all these hundreds of problems get solved with a group effort Then they all stick this in GitHub in the central repo, and then they built a site for it and said, hey, if you want Bootstrap, come here, and it'll solve all of your responsive design problems. And so some of the people at Squarespace grabbed that piece of open source software, stuck it into Squarespace, and behind the scenes, while you're building your site, there's this piece of open source software. Now that's just one example. Probably in Squarespace, there's thousands of open source pieces of open source software, and they're powering everything from the user interface that you see, to the middleware that makes decisions for you, to the database that knows who you are, who your website is, what your password is, what your cookies are, et cetera, et cetera. And all these layers have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different packages of either off-the-shelf or off-the-shelf and extended open source software. So this is why you can go from idea to proof of concept and product in 2 or 3 months now, as opposed to devoting years and years and years to develop one product that you could possibly sell for a profit, 5 years from the inception date. Now you can have something up and running in a couple of months and get feedback from the market weeks thereafter and know if you're onto something, and then move on if you're not. Or move on and then times change and you go, hey, maybe we were ahead of our time. Maybe this is a better time. Re-release it, redeploy it. Public gives you feedback, and then now your time has come. So it behooves everybody, again, to move faster, cycle through ideas faster, get your products and ideas out there, and don't build from scratch. Leverage the tools that exist, and maximize your chances of being successful, and maximize your opportunities for.
And also, it sounds like you have to be aware of. It would be my assumption, because if this is a global industry, and it sounds like basically that's what we've gotten here, then there has to be some idea of how other countries work politically, socially. There's got to be some protocol when you say, if you're working with China, for instance, there's a way of working with China that you would not use or wouldn't do if you were working with Canada. Just take the word freedom. You have the freedom to do this. In China, the word freedom has to mean something different than what it means in Canada. And I say that because having been to China, assuming that I had freedom, and turned on my cell phone and I couldn't get Google, I didn't feel like I had freedom. It was a different kind of way of working in the world when I can't go to Google. So, and that wouldn't be so in Canada. I can get Google. So when you're working across platforms, and you're working with different countries and different political situations, what would be some of the things that you'd be concerned about? Or would there be a concern?
Right. Yeah. That's a great question. I think that there are very profound considerations when moving cross borders. China is a particularly egregious example. I mean, they're kind of a closed system. I think a lot of the difficulty in operating there is trying to be you're dealing within a closed system in an open source world, and trying to build products and services that are designed to function in a more open world, and yet the system in which you're confined is essentially closed. I think that creates a lot of friction. And I'm seeing two profound ways this is bleeding over. The first one is that people in China are figuring out ways to get around the closed system by VPNs and various other tricks to allow them to be at parity in terms of information flow with the rest of the world. And the flip side of that is that China, because it has this giant market, is is able to strong arm normally free and open source vendors from freer countries to impose Chinese style social control restrictions on their users and social monitoring restrictions on their users in order to have access to Chinese markets. So China is saying you got to take draconian measures on your existing user base in order to operate in our markets. And Chinese markets are saying, the participants in Chinese markets are saying, we need freer and more open, free-flowing markets in order to compete with the rest of the world. So somewhere in the middle is where it will meet. Hopefully not too far in the middle, because I don't think that it's healthy to have. I think that the fact that the tech sector as the driving force since it's been the driving force of American markets in particular, Western markets in general, and I don't think restricting it and making it more intrusive, invasive, and compromising privacy is the way to maximize profit, maximize creativity and innovation. That is definitely not the way to go. However, this is precisely the message that some of the big companies in America who are itching to get into Chinese markets, that's precisely what the Chinese government is telling them. And quiet as it's kept, they are quietly and trying to figure out a way to comply with the Chinese to get access to the markets without basically telling their existing customers that these are the kind of draconian measures that are going on. And I think it's very disingenuous, and I don't think it's going to work. And I think it's a great source of consternation to myself, and it's going to be a continued source of friction going forward. So the Apples and the Googles of the world are being more restrictive and more invasive and more
well, I'm not going to. We could go into this philosophical. That's a deep subject that could go on for 5 hours.
That's a whole nother podcast.
Yes, but I want to thank you for participating in my first podcast, and hopefully we can revisit you at another time, if you're available, because I think your life and your the work you do is fascinating. And I think this is going to open up the conversation for others to add on to the ideas and the concepts that we've talked about today.
Yeah, I hope so. That'd be great.
Yeah, and here's the other thing is that it shows that you came to Hewlett Packard at a time when African Americans were really coming into our own, because we were recruiting heavily in the historically black colleges and bringing African Americans to the Valley. In fact, our demographic numbers were the largest they've ever been. And so you were part of that group of young black professionals that came into the Valley and contributed to the Hewlett Packards, the Apples, the companies Tandem, Lockheed, Fairchild, that were really just struggling.
Were we like second generation, you think?
I think you might have been more like the third because the second generation probably they were working, you don't know about them because they were working in so many highly secretive programs that had to do with the Polaris missiles and space programs and nuclear programs that they couldn't talk about. So we don't, it's hard to even pull the information out of them to this day because it is so highly secretive. But the young folks who came in the mid 80s, going into the 90s, you were able to benefit from their experience and come out of those secret programs into more commercial type use of the products that had been developed during those times. So
yeah, sure, we're the internet generation.
You're the internet generation, absolutely, and because the intranet was there, and it was primarily through the universities, if my memory serves me right. Universities and people like Lockheed, Fairchild, HP, who had government contracts, were privy to it, but it was not a national or global giant like it is today. So I want to thank you for coming and helping me out with my first podcast. And I wanted to ask you, would you again repeat some of the free source
open source. Yeah.
Open source.
I mean, there's so many. Like I'll just rattle off a few just for entertainment purposes. But there's frameworks like Django. It depends what kind of there's entire frameworks which give you all the tiers to build like a multi-tiered internet application. So there's things like Django for Python, and then there's Node.js for JavaScript, which is end-to-end JavaScript, front end, back end, middleware. There's Ruby on Rails, that's kind of falling out of favor. Then there's smaller frameworks like Flask, and these are just people that have been reinventing the wheel until they perfected it, and then been able to abstract out all the really difficult problems and break it down into a few simple commands, which would normally take hundreds and hundreds of lines of code. But you've been leveraging other people's work for a couple of decades now, so we don't want to keep reinventing the wheel. So that's one thing. Let's see. There's RSpec for testing. There's things like Kubernetes for DevOps and deployment. There's Docker containers for DevOps and deployments. This is more moving towards people would release apps in these sort of monolithic 3-tiered structures, and then that was not sustainable, and it became very brittle. So as internet traffic increased and as cloud services increased, you increasingly started breaking things up into microservices, where there was a bunch of little tiny units that all talk to each other, and they could sort of quickly, think of little cells, and each little cell had a different function. You have liver cells like a body, like liver cells do liver stuff, and kidney cells do kidney stuff, and bone cells do bone stuff, and they all communicate with each other. Well, same with the applications. Things that move data do this kind of stuff. Things that do AI are over here, and things that do front end and presentation do it over here, and things that do business logic over here. And then all these little cells, these little tiny programs, they're all written in different languages, because certain languages are just better for other things. So you don't have these big frameworks anymore. You have these little services that handle this one thing. I get cookies. I get data I get names and addresses from databases. I get, user IDs, and all these little services combine and aggregate, and then are sort of orchestrated by another set of services, and then all of that data comes back and does what it's supposed to do and results in what you see on your screen. And that can handle one user, or it can handle 1 million users in a matter of milliseconds. Whereas before, if you had a monolith and you went up to 1 million users in a couple seconds, you were going to notice some performance degradation. Where now, these things are so nimble and small that when they get 1 million users, it just scales up and you don't notice any performance degradation. But your costs go up, right? Because you're paying per usage. Then when it scales back down to 1 user, you don't notice, because but your costs shrink dramatically because now you're using less resources. So it's kind of like everybody's riding in a taxi cab now. The meter's running, and you have all these little services, and each one has the meter running, and you're paying as you go, but you're only paying for what you use. And if you compare that to the cost of having to spend millions of dollars to invest in actual hardware and maintain it and run it and scale it up and down and use it for failover, it's a considerable cost savings. So it's just, the market pressure to get more and more efficient is realized in the necessity is the mother of invention, right? So it's being realized in these new creative solutions to these bigger, more nasty, complex problems that occur every day. And then every time you solve one, there's 10 more.
So the life of a DevOps goes on and on and on. All right.
Yeah, DevOps engineers, DevOps, don't stop, baby. DevOps, don't stop. Okay.
All right. So we will find, again, we will have a list of these sites that if you're interested on my website, Kathy Cotton, digitalstoryteller.com.
Digital storyteller.
Thank you, Chris, for a wonderful first start to my podcast series, Cotton Tales Podcast. We can be found on my website, www.aplaceatthetable.live/podcast, or on iTunes. I will return with a new, fresh podcast very soon. Send me an email at kcdigitalstoryteller@gmail.com, and I'll add you to my mail list. Thanks for listening.